Cognitive psychotherapy relies on a foundational premise that observing our own thoughts is how we fix them. The assumption is that deliberate metacognition, the ability to categorize and accurately self-report your internal state, is both curative and correct. But look at human beings operating at their absolute peak, what psychologists term flow states. Whether it is a surgeon operating or a musician improvising, optimal performance requires the total absence of self-consciousness. The exact moment that person stops to ask, "Am I in flow right now?" the state instantly shatters. The question destroys its own answer. We see this exact failure mode across clinical psychiatry. In social anxiety, the act of deliberately monitoring your own internal state and external presentation actively generates the physical deterioration you fear. In chronic pain, consciously scanning the body for pain sensations, catastrophizing, measurably amplifies the pain's intensity. This vulnerability makes sense when mapped against our evolutionary baseline. For millennia, human survival relied on forms of knowledge like speculative tracking. A sand tracker does not stand outside the system to observe it. Knowledge emerges from a continuous, embodied merging with the environment and the animal, rather than detached self-reporting. When you force a continuously changing system to stop and produce a fixed account of its own state, you do not capture the original state. You create a completely new state, the state of being measured. This structural failure is the domestication problem. This means our primary psychological tools, the diagnostic interviews and symptom checklists, do not capture reality. They measure a patient's compliance with a representational convention. They domesticate the living subject to fit the rigid limitations of the tool, compromising the clinical encounter before it even begins. We can trace this paradox directly into the physical architecture of the brain. This model illustrates the default mode network, the region that activates during self-reflection and autobiographical memory. Notice how its activation causes the frontoparietal control network, the area responsible for attentive engagement with the external world, to immediately go dark. These networks are strictly anti-correlated. The biological instrument used to measure the self actively suppresses the neural architecture required to perform a skilled, coupled action. Cognitive science defines this reality through inactivism. An organism does not process internal representations of the world like a computer reading a file. Instead, cognition is the physical enactment of a world through continuous, recurrent interactions, a process cognitive scientists call structural coupling. Because what we call knowing is actually this unbroken physical coupling, the organism cannot stop to read its own internal state without severing that connection entirely. The map cannot fold back onto the territory it is actively bringing forth. Accurate self-tracking is ontologically impossible. Yet modern clinical psychiatry operates as if the mind is a static hard drive. A patient walks into a clinic and is handed a structured diagnostic questionnaire, like the DSM-5 checklist, demanding they rigidly categorize a highly fluid experience. The philosopher Gilbert Simondon defined a living subject not as a fixed object, but as a metastable process of becoming, always existing between states. When you insert a measurement probe and force that system to represent itself, you trigger premature individuation. The dynamic, unresolved tension of the patient's mind is forced to artificially crystallize. A fluid phase becomes a fixed identity. The sociologist Ian Hacking documented the exact consequences of this crystallization through his theory of looping effects in human classification. Unlike a rock or a quark, which remain indifferent to how they are categorized, classified humans are acutely aware of their labels. Once given a framework for interpreting their distress, patients unconsciously modify their self-understanding and behavior to make their experience legible within that exact framework. The diagnosis becomes a closed mirror. Every subsequent emotion is filtered through the categorical lens of the disorder, and the disorder is validated by every subsequent emotion. The surrounding medical and social care systems lock this loop in place, treating the patient strictly according to the label. The vast pre-individual potential that existed before the assessment is entirely foreclosed by the administrative identity assigned to it. The Diagnostic Act actively constructs, entrenches, and confirms the pathology it claims to observe. This makes categorical psychiatry structurally iatrogenic. Escaping this trap requires abandoning self-reporting categories. Instead, we evaluate the living system from the outside using continuous dimensional field parameters. This topological map tracks those parameters dynamically. The first parameter is ground, or G, the baseline of physical, external, and nervous system safety a person possesses. The second is gamma, the system's capacity for metacognitive distance and reflective flexibility. The third is delta squared, the nonlinear signal intensity of whatever stressor or trauma is moving through the system. Finally, H, the harmonic coefficient, measures the overall coherence or fragmentation of the entire psychological field. These four parameters combine to form the emergence equation. When a system possesses high ground and intact gamma, it can metabolize massive spikes in delta squared. A severe life stressor acts as a catalyst for profound transformative growth. The mathematical inverse is equally true. If ground is collapsed from poverty, sleep deprivation, or relational loss, even a minor signal intensity will completely overwhelm and fragment the field. This leads directly to the clinical capacity equation. Expressed capacity equals native capacity minus constraints. The clinical objective shifts to identifying and removing the specific environmental or systemic constraints, like poverty or relational disruption, that block a person's native capacity for regulation. By tracking continuous dimensions from the outside, the clinician preserves the patient's biological sovereignty. We map the extremes of human psychological distress without ever arresting the patient's dynamic potential for recovery. The structural principle that self-observation collapses the state being observed operates at every scale. When this loop consumes a whole population, the result is democratic epistemic closure, a collective instance of the domestication problem. This closure begins as a survival reflex. Under conditions of sustained systemic threat, economic insecurity, social fragmentation, or rapid cultural shifts, a collective system craves extreme ground to stabilize itself. The system responds by tightening its categories and reducing its tolerance for ambiguity. This results in G-access, the overdevelopment of categorical stability at the direct expense of gamma, or reflective capacity. The system locks into this Ouroboros state. Like a snake consuming its own tail, the belief system becomes its own only validator. Every incoming piece of data is digested purely to confirm existing prejudices. From within the plane of the loop, the system appears entirely flat and closed. But if we shift our perspective, we see that the flat circle is actually a three-dimensional spiral viewed from above. The difference between a closed loop and a moving spiral is invisible until you introduce a vertical z-axis, a position of altitude. A closed belief system cannot generate its own z-axis. It lacks the altitude to see its own loop. Breaking epistemic closure requires an external reflective surface that provides that altitude without triggering a defensive collapse. The mechanical solution to this paradox is found in the extended mind thesis, which argues that cognition is not bounded by the skull. To monitor a system safely, the monitoring function must be offloaded directly into the environment. We already do this somatically through interoceptive biofeedback. Instead of showing a patient a numeric stress score, which triggers a self-evaluating panic, the technology alters the ambient light or sound in the room to reflect their physiological state. The body processes the environmental change and auto-regulates naturally, completely bypassing the brain's default mode network. We can achieve an equivalent cognitive z-axis through generative large language models. These systems act as an external reflective surface for human thought. However, AI systems engineered solely for user validation reinforce the existing loop. A system that only seeks approval returns the user's constructions in a form that confirms them, acting as a G-axis amplifier. To act as a true therapeutic surface, the AI must maintain productive friction. As data flows between the user and the external node, the system holds the structure of the human's thought just long enough to make it visible, reflecting it back without forcing it into rigid categories. This gentle feedback alters the trajectory of the thought. It allows the mind to ride the z-axis, escaping the flat geometry of its own closed loop. The design challenge for clinical psychiatry and human-AI alignment is building tools that track the living system entirely from the outside. Only then can consciousness heal, adapt, and evolve. without ever being forced to diagnosticate itself.